Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Cindu, and I'm one of the team members for Malayalees for Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's discussion. So for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are a volunteer-led organization of Malayalees, which means people who originate from Kerala, India, and we are committed to disrupting anti-Black racism. So one of the pillars of our organization is to educate our own community and the larger US American community about how anti-Blackness manifests itself in the larger US American, just in our country. And through this, we strive to evolve as an anti-racist immigrant community. So our panel discussions are just one of the ways that we work to educate. Today we are doing our last panel for the systemic racism, which is environmental racism. And for those of you who have joined us in the past, welcome back and thank you for your support. And for those of you who are new, welcome to our community. So we have a solid lineup of panelists today who I'm really excited to converse with. These are all leaders in the environmentalism and sustainability space, and they have so much to teach us. So without further ado, I want to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves and why they care about this topic. And if you want to learn more details about their professional background, we do have all of their bios up on the Facebook page. So Greg, how about you kick it off?
Yeah, hi, my name's Greg Kandankulam. Really thankful to be here with my community talking about these topics. I started my career in naval nuclear power in the late 90s. So I've been working in the energy space for about 24 years. And then about 10 years ago, I received my master's in sustainable management from Presidio Graduate School here in San Francisco, where I live. It enhanced my perspective on the outcomes of policy and how we vote with our dollars, and how the products that we buy and the way we talk about those products impact not just ourselves, but the communities that and stakeholders that support the making of those products and how they are delivered to us. And so, my role is to educate customers and even our own internal strategy on how we provide better outcomes for our constituents, our customers, and our larger stakeholders.
Cool, thanks. And Rachana?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachana Shah, and I live in New York City. Many years ago, I used to work in the IT sector, which I suspect many people watching here work in as well. And while I loved that, there was a nagging need for me to go back and study the environment, which is something I've been passionate about for my whole life. I went to the University of Michigan and I graduated in 2012 with a dual master's and MBA MS in environmental sustainability. And just recently, I started my own business called Aspire to Zero, which is a zero waste consulting business, which helps schools and small businesses in achieving their waste reduction goals. I feel very passionate about this topic because I've always been very interested in racial justice as well. And you go along life thinking it's either, now I'm going to go do a protest for racial justice, and now I'm going to do a protest for the environment next week. But actually, there's just such a big overlap. And it was a big light bulb moment for me when I was doing some systems thinking to realize that there is such a big impact, because if you just reduce down racial justice to police brutality, you wouldn't know that there are so many ways in which Black and Brown communities are negatively impacted by climate change. And so that's, some of the things that we're going to talk about today, but now I just know I don't have to pick one cause or the other, because they are very, very linked together.
Thank you, Rachana. And Richu?
Hi, everyone. My name is Richu Aby. I am a Instagram blogger for conscious consumerism. My handle is Sustainabitch. I have been passionate about sustainable apparel and supply chain, the retail space for about 8 years now, but I recently got activated to do more in this space because of COVID and the impact that it's having for everybody that's either artisans or working in the retail space. This pandemic is affecting them the most. As all of my co-panelists have said, the effects of ecological environmental changes affect people of color the most. And there are a lot of women, specifically in South Asia, that have been hit by COVID and by environmental practices the most. That's why I'm activated to be in this space, predominantly because of COVID and how much I knew about the space and all the things that were going wrong and I didn't hear anybody speaking up about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. So thank all of you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. So just a little bit of background, Malayalees for Black Lives Matter was started back in June after the murder of George Floyd, which really began the national uprising against anti-Black racism. And George Floyd's last words were, "I can't breathe." And the lack of breath is something that is so pervasive within anti-Blackness, from police brutality to COVID-19. And if you weren't aware, Black Americans continue to experience the highest COVID-19 mortality rates nationwide, more than twice as high as white Americans and Asian Americans. Another fact I wanted to share that's related to the lack of breath is that Black Americans are 5 times more likely to die from asthma when compared to white Americans. And so George Floyd himself suffered from asthma. And this brings me to my first question, which I want to pose to Greg. Greg, why is George Floyd's asthma significant to this conversation about environmental racism and sustainability?
Yeah, great question. And it's absolutely an important concept to discuss as a complication. But, I think maybe we should kind of figure, or at least talk about an operational definition of sustainability within kind of the public sector and private sector spaces in which I work. The idea is that it's a triple bottom line, a 3-legged stool, where you are maximizing, not trade-offs, but maximizing environmental performance, social outcomes, and then it all has to pencil economically. And so starting with that, that's kind of the lens of which I approach everything that I do in my career. But first, let's not lose sight of the fact, right? And that's that Derek Chauvin and his knee is what killed George Floyd. But the complications and how we talk about the complications around his death are really important, especially when it comes to accountability. The local coroner in Minneapolis said that it was his underlying physical conditions, drug use, heart disease, complicated by police subdual that killed him. And meanwhile, the autopsy done by a third party for the attorney for the defense said that, or I'm sorry, for attorney for Floyd's family, said that it was asphyxia complicated by the heart disease and things of that nature. So basically saying the same thing, but spinning it very differently, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we need to look at when we're voting. We talk about accountability, and building upon that, right? Looking at over-policing and how that ties into environmental justice. In 2016, 2 University of California professors did a study after the deaths of Eric Garner and Mario Woods in 2014, 2015. And, in those cases, police killed people in what would be considered quality of life incidences that would have resulted in tickets. And those were all complicated in certain circumstances by physical condition. In these places where you have redlining and less investment in healthy outcomes for some of these disenfranchised communities, like healthcare, access to fresh produce. You have these vulnerabilities: obesity, diabetes, asthma. That in these circumstances where you have higher instances of these physical maladies, it's almost like those vulnerabilities have been weaponized.
Okay, thank you. And does anyone want to add to that before I move on? All right, so Richu, how are communities of color, specifically Black communities, impacted by manufacturing/industrial plants and refineries in ways that other racially privileged communities are not impacted by?
Sure. So generally speaking, what I speak to is the fashion industry. Definitely plants are the main proponent of why people are getting sick when they're living next to these plants that are spewing out textile waste. You see that over and over again as a pattern, but specifically in America, we're not a textile producing market. So these plants that are producing other types of goods like plastics and styrofoam, different kinds of products that use complex chemicals, where they're concentrated, you see a lot of maladies and a lot of deaths and cancer. So I want to give an example, and I think it will be listed in the comments. It's called Cancer Valley. It is a 85 strip of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It is a predominantly Black community, and there are 150 different kinds of plants in that area. The community is very strong in stating publicly that these plants are the ones causing the different cancer cases, miscarriages, and deaths in their community. They were previously not an actual town, but they came together as they were disenfranchised. They came together to create themselves into a public space so that they can advocate for themselves, which is a very, their story since the 80s has been very moving. The whole country is watching them, and they are just making waves in advocating for environmental justice because it's their community. They're breathing the air, their people, their families are the ones that are dying. So these marginalized communities, like this 85 strip of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, that is the kind of communities that are affected most by environmental issues around the world, but especially in America as well.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I was not familiar with Cancer Valley before you just mentioned that. So
yes.
And Rachana, Black communities are disproportionately impacted by waste and incineration. Can you speak on that based off your expertise?
Sure. Previously, our biggest way to deal with waste has been to landfill it. But recently, a couple of years ago, China has decided to not take a lot of our recyclables. And so we were forced to, because we don't have the recycling infrastructure in place to handle a much larger load than what we were doing prior to China taking our recyclables. And also because of a kind of a perverse subsidy for renewable energy, waste management people had an incentive to actually burn waste. And that's been a more recent phenomenon. I mean, it was going on, but now it's been kind of ramped up. And as they decide to make more of these, or the ones that they've made are actually 79% of them are 3 miles within low income and minority communities. These fumes that come out of these incineration plants are can include lead, it can include mercury, and even soot particles. So it's definitely very toxic, although the actual impacts of those gases is not completely figured out yet. However, this can account for 4.4 million people who live, 3 miles within an incineration plant. And because Black Americans are 20 times as more likely to have asthma as compared to their white counterparts, or 3 times more likely to die because of an asthma-related condition, then living within these kind of communities is just exacerbating the problem. Also, on top of that, hazardous waste sites are also predominantly in low income and minority communities. And so these are those, extremely toxic waste that they have Superfund sites that they have to dispose of in a very specific way. But actually, because of climate change, this is just an example, but because of climate change, if there's floods or other kind of natural disasters near these sites, it's actually exposing a lot of these very, very toxic chemicals. And so there's just a lot over there about handling waste. And I mean, actually going to a zero waste perspective is the only desirable way to handle all of this. But in the meantime, as we transition to something like that, we have to constantly ask ourselves, what are we going to do with all this waste we produce?
And I'm sure that that was probably one of the impetuses of your business, right?
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for sharing some of your insights based off of your own work within the space. I want to move on and talk a little bit about whiteness. And so one of our last panelists, Sherrod Robbins, he stated, and I quote, "Anti-Blackness lives within whiteness." And it was a really powerful statement. And I think that for people who are really committed to disrupting anti-Blackness, we have to talk about whiteness, right? So we can expose it and try to disrupt it. And so how does whiteness manifest in the sustainability and environmental movement? And this is an open question to anyone who wants to take it first.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that first. I would say that, it kind of started in the 70s, right? So you had the environmental movement, walking hand in hand with, racial justice movements, right, and civil rights. If you look back then, those two movements were somewhat segregated, right? Where you had some white champions working within civil rights, but not mainstream. And you did not necessarily have people of color marching along for environmental movements because they were marching for the ability to just live peacefully, right? So, and then, fast forward, the environmentalists of the 70s kind of learned their lesson a bit. You engage with the market by working within, not waving a finger in their face without actual solutions, right? So trying to come at this with a solution-based format is how environmentalism kind of evolved into sustainability as a business and public policy practice. And so that's kind of setting the table for a second. But and then there's another form of participation. It's just people who actually work in sustainability now, who was attracted to those sustainable business leaders, and where do they talk, right? Usually at well-heeled, well-moneyed halls and institutions of academia and large business roundtables. The base of the pyramid it was almost what I would consider almost like trickle down when you look at how the market was engaged by sustainable business leaders, and that the outcomes once you start from the top would reach kind of deck plate level and community level. And then also kind of looking at where these people talk, some of the largest corporate sustainability conferences, 3,000-4,000 people that happen several times a year. If you just walk those halls, you'll see tons of underrepresentation, right? If you look at the biggest companies, you look at their chief sustainability officers, you look at chief resilience officers at the largest cities in America, predominantly white. And so, while they understand the problem, it's been a long road to correct it.
Yeah. So just like most industries, the CFOs, C-suite are white folks, and they're not personally impacted by the plants and all of the damage that's being done. So they see it from a different perspective.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So adding on to that, similar in my own field, which is fashion, a lot of the bloggers or people speaking out about fast fashion and the environmental and sustainable space in fashion are white women. You don't very often see men, and you don't very often see people of color in the space, and that's important because representation for South Asian, South Americans are important because you are more closely tied to the areas that are affected. And not that you can speak up more for them, but you have a closer impact in social change. It's not a fad, it's not a hashtag, they're real people, this is a real area, and these are real lives. So that's the difference between it. And you could just speak more honestly about the areas that are impacted if you visited.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's people in the middle, but often if there was white Americans were interested in environmentalism, it was often because of conservation or way of saving, like saving parks, saving national lands. A lot of them did not see these kind of overlaps with racial justice. And then on the other hand, people who were fighting for racial justice did not see that that there was these overlaps with climate. And so, I mean, I think there has been an awakening lately, but yeah, I mean, it's true that if you're a white American who's fighting for climate justice or to reduce climate change, because you want, you know, to keep on hiking, it's great. I mean, I support anyone who tries to help the environment for any reason, but it's not fair to close your eyes to the ways in which these two movements overlap.
Yeah.
Right. I think the article that you posted earlier this week about how the circles are practically on top of each other was a very powerful statement to make. If you are an environmentalist, then you must also be part of the social justice movement. They're literally on top of each other, and that brings to light the conversation of intersectionality in environmentalism and how important that is, not just for women, but all people. You know, even if you're white, you need to be you need to be aware of the subject and know how it impacts your community, and not just shopping habits, in my perspective.
Yep. You know, I would add on to you know, a bit of an anecdote in terms of access as well, right? You know, you think about the environmental movement and policy and how that works at kind of the highest levels of business management and conversations around assets and how money moves and performs with a, you know, an environmental bent. But the other part of this is also, you know, a lot of us interact with how we live and how we purchase things and how we talk about our lives based on what's going on in our neighborhoods and with examples in the community. And you know, the energy industry has a huge whiteness problem. You know, people who work in power plants invariably are 60-year-old white men. You know, even on the clean energy side or participation in the clean energy economy, we're seeing a lot of the same issues. You're seeing young white men working in renewable energy, very much so at the corporate level, and then even so at the execution implementation level. You know, installing solar, installing wind, and so, you know, we're seeing community-based grassroots level movements trying to talk to at-risk youth, other disenfranchised, you know, low-skilled workers to be able to participate in the clean energy economy and in you know, renewable energy. One example that I can think of is Solar Richmond. So that's in the Richmond, California. So in the East Bay, where they actually bring that know-how and get people on roofs doing installations so that they can become that, you know, that next participant in this cleaner economy. So, you know, you're seeing people use their privilege and whiteness to be able to start these initiatives in underserved locations.
Thanks. It sounds like we need to do a better job overall centering Blackness and brownness within this movement, because there is so much whiteness. When you said hiking, I laughed because I do have friends that will say, I'm not going to go hiking. That's like a white supremacist activity, which, you know, people are pretty extreme, but thank you for that. So, you know, I want to move on to my third question. And, you know, the people who hold power in our society have worked to shape what is happening in our environment, both nationally and globally. And, you know, I'm just curious to know what you all think about what has the Trump administration done or not done to address climate injustice.
I'll take a first stab. Nobody minds? All right. Yeah, you know, he started way before he actually took office, right? Even right after the election, he sent a memo to the EPA wanting a list of anybody who worked on the concept of the social cost of carbon, right? So how emissions, how fossil affects all communities, and you know, not wanting to put numbers to how it was disproportionately affecting Black and Indigenous people of color. And so, you know, right away, you're having people of conscience who are working at the EPA for multiple administrations in fear of this kind of Valentine's Day massacre going on in terms of people who are working on some of these issues of disenfranchisement, of climate change, how that affects everyone from industry to public infrastructure, and then also to some of our most vulnerable communities. And so, just looking at that in and of itself was terrifying, right after he was elected, before he was inaugurated. Since then, he's had the most amount of lobbyists in all the agencies that protect consumers and the environment, from coal lobbyists at the EPA, non-science administrators at NASA who also have a climate agency. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration just installed a climate denier as its head administrator. So all of these taken en masse just shows a systematic destruction of any kind of substantive federal stance on climate change. And to add fuel to that fire, then we exited from the Paris Accords. And so then the interesting thing there is that I would say in retaliation to the federal exit of that accord, the We're Still In campaign took effect. It was a multinational campaign, but what we saw was that sustainability, climate action was going to become hyperlocal. That you would have towns and cities and counties and states taking the charge up, as well as as private industry understanding their contribution to the problem, right? So you started having scientifically based target initiatives. You started having, understanding what your baselines and what you needed to emit by 2030, 2050. Many companies have really are taking a really strong look at transforming themselves en masse by 2050 to meet those climate goals. And so, while I do think that Trump's and the federal policy has been disastrous for this country, the grassroots activation of people around environmental justice definitely took off as a result of that. And so that's been heartening to see. But when you go back to that debacle of a debate and you hear things like immaculate water and immaculate air, that doesn't take into any account the systemic needs to address climate change, and how that's not a national issue. It's not a specific industry issue, but that it's a global issue, and that we've been global leaders on so many topics in the past, that for us to see this is pretty gross.
Yeah, I would agree.
So yeah, I mean, Greg definitely touched on a bunch of the things that he did. I mean, taking us out of the Paris Climate Accord was pretty awful, because I mean, it takes so much to get 160 plus countries to agree to one agreement. And that was really hard fought by a lot of people. I know people who went to those negotiations, and I mean, that was just such a big victory. It didn't go far enough, but at least we finally had something down that all the countries agreed to. And then for America, that has the highest greenhouse gas emissions per person by far. I'm actually now, it's like, I mean, Australia is up there, as well as one other country that's escaping me. But my point is, we are way up there as the highest per person emitters. And for us to just back out is extremely irresponsible, and it doesn't give voice to major things, such as an increase by many millions of climate refugees that are gonna be coming up as these natural disasters get worse from climate change. But beyond that, I mean, the Trump administration has done absolutely nothing for the environment. And I think it's really been their pride and joy to destroy things that previous administrations have worked hard to do. And I'm just going to give a couple examples just so you like understand that, like, Obama's clean power plan, it's something that that he also worked hard to do, and it could have saved us so much greenhouse gas emissions, and instead President Trump, through Scott Pruitt, rolled that back, right? So that one just in itself will mean an extra 1,630 premature deaths, an extra 120,000 additional asthma attacks, 140,000 missed school days, 48,000 lost work days. I mean, this is one thing. I have this long list, but just things that were just already happening or just like mindlessly rolled back. And I mean, not mindlessly, I'm sure it was just because some very powerful people, and that's what we're up against here. And that's why these two causes overlap so much, because ultimately it's controlled by very powerful people. Yeah, it's even just another example. There's methane that leaks from landfills that have been like closed up, that are done, that are full. But methane leaks from them, and Obama had created a plan that would make these waste management companies find ways to reduce this leakage. And all of the companies were already starting to put these infrastructures into place. And once again, this was just rolled back, and this is going to lead to I forget the figure, but I think it's like 20,000 more premature deaths. So these have real world impacts, and I mean, you can guess who is going to be impacted more from these, but it's going to be Black and brown communities. So it's just very distressing to me, and I mean, I'm really ready for a change for this.
I wanted to.
Sorry, I just wanted
the EPA. Go ahead, Greg.
Sorry, I just wanted to add real quick to the topics that you mentioned. The interesting thing about the Clean Power Program was that it was just on paper. It actually never had been rolled out. And the message in 2015 was that it was killing jobs, and it actually was still on the drawing board. It was still in the comment period. Industry was ready to welcome that regulation in most circumstances. Mm-hmm. Basically what I would consider is corporate welfare or industrial welfare to give coal a lifeline, because it was already dying on the vine, right? Coal plants were already being shut down for economic reasons in places like Texas, where there's more wind on the grid than there is coal. So it was an interesting thing to watch the Trump administration or the campaign put the cart before the horse and say that regulation was killing coal before the regulation even came out. And then they got to repeal it, kind of in an underhanded way. So, messaging matters, right? Truth matters, right? And spin needs to be held accountable. And so that was a really interesting thing that I watched happen as an insider. And the other piece about methane leakage, right? No one knows exactly what the percentage of methane leaks from these natural gas supply wellheads. Some people say 3%, some people say 12% of total capacity. There's not a good business model for recouping that or paying for certifications for wellhead leakage. But one methane molecule is 70 times as destructive as a CO2 molecule in the atmosphere. So, it's a silent killer that a lot of people do not know about. And in Southern California, they had the Aliso Canyon leakage, which was probably one of the most destructive environmental disasters of our time. But a lot of people don't know about it because it's not a pelican covered in oil. Right, natural gas is odorless and tasteless, and so people aren't aware of what's going on when they talk about natural gas being a bridging fuel. That it's going to be, part of a longer term strategy. Natural gas is doing lots of destruction to our environment.
Something that jumped out at me when you were speaking, Greg, was accountability. I think the EPA was a huge arm for accountability all over America, and because it's kind of been gutted, people are not, so they're a little bit more laissez-faire with how they're dealing with plants and with energy. As we rolled back from the Paris Accords, you saw a lot of, before we were in the Paris Accords, we had a lot of divesting from these problematic industries within our discussion. And now that we are pulled out, you see reinvestment, and that's going to take a huge, it's going to double back on all the work that we've done as a country. So the EPA is a Republican structure, and the accountability that it posed for a lot of the conservative structure. A lot of the work that was done was to hold plants accountable. And now, you know, as a country, we are rolling back. We are moving backwards in clean air, clean rivers, healthy forests.
Yeah. I'd also like to add one more thing, which is like very personal to me because I studied behavior change, is that it very much upsets me that President Trump would use his extensive media coverage to kind of crap all over energy efficient appliances, energy efficient, any kind of actions that people take. I mean, you know, I've always learned that we sacrifice and sacred have the same root word, and we sacrifice for the things that that are sacred to us. And so, you know, having a low flow shower head or a low flow toilet, you know, might be a sacrifice, but it's, you know, doing these individual behaviors is important. And for him to just constantly talk about them and act like, oh, you know, we could just go on and on forever with, you know, these kinds of things that were just poorly designed from the get is also, to me, very distressing.
You know, you talked about, you know, some of this, the administration and how they're kind of reversing the progress that was made. Why do you think that is? You know, why do you think that we pulled out of the Paris Agreement? Why do you think that, you know, the EPA, you know, was divested? Like, what are your thoughts about that for people who are, you know, listening that don't know a lot about this topic?
People with personally friends in high places, you know,
that's the short answer, and it's true.
all the money.
I do think that's true as well. I mean, I think it was framed as a, why do we have to do all these things? You know, why doesn't China do as much? And sure, China actually has the highest amount of emission total, but they also have 2 billion people, you know? So, you know, it's a complicated issue. And I mean, sure, it's a legitimate question to ask, but not enough to pull us out of something that was hard fought by so many people. You know, obviously there was also just a vendetta against a past administration, but no, I think Richu's spot on that. Like, most of the people that were going to benefit from taking us out of that were people that either were friends of his or just people who are high up donating to these campaigns. It's sad to say, but yeah, I think for them it was an easy thing to just take away.
So monetary reasons for money. Okay.
Exactly correct.
All right. You know, Richu, you had mentioned, you know, one time when we were talking about, you know, the connections with environmental injustice and the fires going on with Indigenous communities. Can you speak a little bit on the intersections of environmental injustice and how it's contributing right now to the fires that have been happening across the West Coast?
Yeah, it's an article that I had picked up, and it was that there's large practices of cutting away underbrush in California and how Native American groups were doing that, and then it was outlawed not too long ago, and you see a lot of the brush fires and the fires that are happening in California and all across the West Coast, as a lot of people would say, in response to not paying attention to what the Native Americans were doing and why they were doing it, why it was important. But it was just a really quick article that I read. I don't have much information outside of that.
Does anyone have anything to add about, you know, the fires on the West Coast?
Yeah, absolutely. Since I woke up with orange skies just outside San Francisco a few weeks ago, you know, I think the perverse thing is that Californians have been saying that due to global warming, that yearly autumnal fire seasons were going to get more and more ferocious, that would spread just beyond autumn. You know, the Santa Cruz fires were lightning storms, which we never get here, right? So we had like Florida, like humid thunderstorms in a part of the country that's considered almost desert, right? So we want to talk about the effects of climate change. You know, all you need to do is come to California And then to have the opposition talk about raking the forests is and that it's a forest management issue. I will say that there is some truth to the forest management issue, that we've been zero tolerance for fires in this country for a very long time, and that did not respect kind of the burn and regrow cycle, and that would have been more helpful to understand that 50, 60 years ago. But the answer is not to give an industry, which we are in the current practice of repealing regulation on, to come in and fix the problem, right? So I don't think that the logging industry is going to fix this without oversight. And so that's another aspect of this that I think is interesting to talk about. And then we also need to talk about who manages these things, right? The state of California only manages 3% of its forests. The federal government manages 60% of California's forests. So where are all the Department of Interior rakes? I haven't seen them, right? So it's great to create some subterfuge around where the problem stems from and how we're going to handle it. But even that piece of accountability hasn't stuck to the administration. And then, when I get a family member from the East Coast telling me about raking forests while I live here in California, and know that I've met people who've left Sonoma County after their second house burnt down, and that people of conscience, people who are trying to live their lives the best way that they can, to hear that California's brought it on themselves and things of that nature is pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, thank you for that. Does anyone have anything else to add about the fires?
I'll add to that too. I think that, I mean, the fundamental problem to me is that we humans have, at least here in America, I'll say, we've put things such as development just over working with nature. We work so apart from nature that it's really had such a detrimental effect. I mean, one example is, when you have marsh and swampland, those kinds of ecosystems are natural storm protection, right? So when we develop and we wipe away an entire ecosystem, we lose that protection as well. So it's not just so simple as, we have to more just think deeply in how we live, how we build, how we create. And actually that plays into this conversation because it's a lot of the ancient cultures that are more connected to the earth that actually can show us a lot of these things. And so as I wrote about in the blog post for MBLM, the Native American cultures, like they practiced controlled burns for decades and centuries, and were able to keep the bigger fires from happening using this ancestral knowledge and other, same thing with like the swamplands and all these things. It's just like if we continue to allow vulnerable older people of color who come from cultures that can teach us these things, we are losing that knowledge. And I think that's just a shame, and we really need to learn to work better with our environment.
Yeah, we can learn a lot from Indigenous communities. So, well, we have about 15 minutes. So unless anyone has anything to add, I'm going to move on. We don't want to leave this conversation without sharing with our viewers what steps can be taken for those of us at home to help fight environmental injustice. And so based off all of your expertise, what can we do at home to help eradicate environmental racism and environmental injustice?
So my big thing is how you spend your dollar today is definitely what you're going to see come from the market tomorrow. So I know that's a widely said and repeated term in the textile apparel industry. How you spend your dollar today will dictate what you see tomorrow. But you need to, just do some research about what it is that you're buying before you buy it. Stop buying random stuff. America is the elite. We have such a huge purchasing power, and where we put that money affects everybody, not just in America, but actually in the world. So with that responsibility on our shoulders, we need to step forward as, part of the 1%.
Great.
So just kind of because I follow you on Instagram, so I think one of your big things is to not just buy what is called fast fashion, to
Yeah.
invest your dollar into clothing that's sustainable and recycle your clothing and be conscious.
Yeah. We need to think about the circular design, about when you're at the point of purchase, where is that item, that piece gonna go when you're done with it? So are you gonna thrift it, or is it quickly trashable? Are you gonna donate it? Even if you donate, things that don't sell in the charity centers, Goodwills, are trashed. We export all of our trash to different countries all over the world. So if it's not sitting in America somewhere on a clean street, it's sitting in a bustling city somewhere around the world. And just because we've exported it away doesn't mean it disappears. So think about what you're buying. That doesn't mean go buy the most expensive thing, keep it forever, and then sell it on Depop. I'm saying if you need a piece, buy it. And make sure you get your full use out of it, sell it or thrift for it. Think about what you're buying when you buy it. I bought a hybrid for that reason specifically, not saying everybody needs to go buy a hybrid, but think about your admission, think about your consumption, and be mindful.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say something along the lines of voting as well, right? We vote two ways, right? We vote at the ballot box and we vote by dollars. So products and services absolutely are informed by the way that they're purchased. And then the other aspect is, looking at these either closely contested races and seeing what they're talking about. One of the things that always disgusts me around this time is watching opponents to climate action make some grudging admission that anthropomorphic or human caused climate change is something, but we need a solution-based approach, right? But then they get into office and then they vote in the exact opposite direction every time, right? So Mitch McConnell just said that he grudgingly admitted that climate change is real and had that party line about solutions-based approach. Meanwhile, McGrath, his opponent, said that it's a national security and international security issue and needs to be approached thusly, right? So I would donate to her if I was everybody on this call. I have. Lindsey Graham did something similar about 6-7 months ago, where he said, "Oh yeah, climate change is real." Talking to his caucus, saying we need to have a better story around this before we lose everybody, including millennial conservatives, who are more receptive to climate science or just science in general than their parents. So looking at how we vote in those two manners really makes a difference.
Okay. So voting and think with be responsible in how you use your dollar. Rachana, any things that we can practically do to help fight climate injustice and environmental injustice?
Well, I mean, I strongly believe in the power of protest as well. Like I mentioned in the blog as well, but they have a lot of money, but we have a lot of people. Yeah. And I know it's the timings with COVID a little bit off, but in general, I mean, going for the future, it's important that we protest either directly to companies who we think are not acting in the environmentally best manner, or to our elected representatives. I mean, I also I put in my blog that even just acknowledging like a few things I think are really important. One is that just recognize that climate change's worst impacts are going to affect low income and minority communities the most. Like, let's all just really understand that. Then secondly, recognize that that everyone has a right to clean air and clean water, and that should be acknowledged. And then recognize that there will be 20 to 25 million climate refugees in the next 20 years, and this is going to cause problems and friction. It's going to cause political instability. But I mean, I'm just talking about it like, I really believe we have to get into the minds of people who are living in Bangladesh or other low-lying places, and really try to imagine, hey, if I lost my livelihood, I have no way to provide for my family. How am I going to survive, right? And this, then it leads to mass migration into urban areas, and then competition for resources. So like this has a lot of major global impacts. But before we just take a immediately like anti-immigrant stance in this country, like recognize that, like I said earlier, Americans per person emit the most greenhouse gases in the world. And then we're just going to shut our borders to people who are potentially impacted. I mean, and I know it's much more complicated. I'm not trying to oversimplify, but I am just saying that we need to recognize some of these uncomfortable truths and work towards a way to make it equitable. We can't just say, well, forget them, that's their problem. We have to move away from the American individualism mindset, because climate change is a global and interconnected and collective problem. And therefore, there is no option but to work with one another. There is no individualism in the future in that sense. So the sooner we get away from that mindset, the better it's going to be, so that all of us can have a healthier environment.
I think one of the things that needs to happen in kind of our kind of discourse with the society at large, with our community at large, which may not agree with some of our underlying assumptions, right, is this idea of self-preservation. So many of our communities, even within the United States, are coastal, right, and already seeing lots of things happen in terms of increased frequency and severity of climatic events. Eventually this is going to start affecting people's portfolio values, their home values, right? Basically assets at risk, right? So in many cases, the conservative conversation always ends up with a boundary that is the white picket fence around a person's home or around their community. And so once, it's not disingenuous to make the conversation about that, because those things are at risk.
Well, thank you. So I'm hearing that we have a question from the audience. I'm waiting to get that question. And then I think we'll probably have time for one last question and we'll wrap up.
And by the way, I just want to mention, like, I'm not against Republicans in that sense. Like ideologically, if we can all just agree that this problem exists, then I'm happy to debate the ways in which we can start to combat it. But to deny it exists is not a proper stance.
Yeah. It's a non-starter for me. To have that, and it's interesting to watch a troll talk about something that they have a casual interest in, with as much gusto and with no shame, to a person who's worked in the industry for 30 years, right?
So
I totally understand that.
So I'm going to switch to the question just because we have about 5 minutes left, and our question comes from one of our viewers, and it goes like this: how can the average consumer really know whether the companies they purchase from are environmentally conscious? Are there any resources that you can recommend?
So the Carbon Disclosure Project puts out a report that is based on a questionnaire that companies submit to. And there are a couple of other frameworks that dovetail off that, but they give a grade on several topics: supply chain engagement, climate action, water, and so you can see a lot about performance based on that. And so it's not, the language usually isn't industry insider, because it's supposed to also inform things like Bloomberg and Bloomberg terminals. It's supposed to inform business leaders who don't necessarily know all the metrics behind climate action, sustainability reporting, and things of that nature. So that's a good place to kind of start.
Can you repeat that source for the people watching?
Oh, the Carbon Disclosure Project. Well, that's what it used to be called. They just go by CDP now. Okay. So CDP.org.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of reporting in supply chain on how transparent it is, so that consumers can understand where their products are coming from, or where their services are coming from in some instances.
Yeah, it's a good place to start.
The GRI, the global reporting initiative. It's something that companies can report to benchmark their sustainability. But if you're just shopping on a Saturday and trying to buy a cute top, you can use Good On You app or the BaptistWorldAid.com. They both grade sustainable product providers, so it's not always clothes, but you can do shoes, clothing, and a bunch of other products that you can buy just every day.
Good to know. I didn't know any of this. Rachana, do you have anything to add about how
I wish I could think of something off the top of my head in terms of resource, but actually it is exhausting to find every eco-friendly thing out there. And I mean, I'm speaking from experience. However, it's important to find your trusted sources and to go to them. So if I wanted to know sustainable companies to buy clothing from, I would go to Richu's blog, excuse me. And you know, if I wanted to know about other zero waste, there's like a lot of bloggers out there. So obviously, like vet the source, make sure you trust the source. But I think, you know, with our access to information, it's beneficial to find your trusted sources and trust their word in what the best places to spend your dollars are.
Yeah.
That's what I do sometimes.
Yeah, and I think
Yeah,
the biggest, oh, go ahead, Greg.
I was just saying that you can get caught up with a lot of companies that greenwash, where sustainability is a marketing exercise more than any strategic one, right? So, and so, you know, as someone who works in sustainability, you can kind of tell how a company views sustainability based on where it sits, right? Is it within finance? Is it within strategy? Is it within marketing? Is it within governmental affairs, right? And then you kind of understand if it's seen as something that needs to be fended off or something that's wholeheartedly embraced, right? So, you know, sometimes it takes a little bit deeper digging, but you know, that's very indicative of how a company is probably performing.
Yeah, so I think the biggest takeaway is it takes effort and energy to do your homework. But if you care about this, then you got to do your homework, right?
I think we all need to be responsible. It's not if you care about it.
You feel better too. Yeah. You feel better wearing that shirt or eating that food knowing that it was made well.
Yeah, and I got one more, a little bit of a macro. You know, I think that the careers of the future need to understand that sustainability needs to be a component of it, right? You know, maybe we weren't necessarily raised that way, right? To look at mission-driven work versus just as much economic outcome as you possibly drive. But you know, doing mission-driven work and understanding the value to society, you know, I view this as doing God's work.
Yeah, you can
remember. So, oh, sorry.
You can actually think about that in a larger context, like career paths. You need to start, especially if you're a millennial or in college, start thinking about sustainability in your own sector, because it's going to touch all of us. There's different trainings you can take, Six Sigma for one, waste elimination. There's plenty of things that you could do to be more conscious just in your sector. It doesn't need to be just in, you know, we've touched on maybe 3 different areas of how sustainability can impact your everyday life, but you, as a service provider, as a worker, can also be sustainable in your work. So you should try to think about how that is and what you're impacting and what the greater image is.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I know that all of your information and your Instagram pages and LinkedIn's are linked in these comments. And so if anyone that's viewing wants more insight or wants to have a deeper conversation, please feel free to reach out to Greg, Richu, or Rachana. So that brings us to our time together. Greg, Rachana, Richu, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your passion with us today. I know I learned a lot. So thank you to our viewers for your interest in this topic, and I hope you'll all leave this session with more informed about the intersections of climate justice and racial justice work, and not only just be more informed, but help to move justice forward. And last, I want to give a special shout out to DB Collective for all the behind scenes help that they have given us through the Systemic Racism series. And if you haven't done so yet, please like or join our Facebook group. We also have an Instagram page, Malayalees for Black Lives Matter, and we could use some love there. We also have a website that has a lot of rich information and resources, so check that out. And we hope to see all of you again in the future. And I think one thing I want to say is please register to vote. Some of those deadlines are even starting today. So look up your state and the registration deadline and register. And I'll leave any last words to our panelists before we sign off.
Vote early.
Yeah, it was so great talking to all of you. This is definitely a very important topic to me, and I hope listening to us talk, you've also been inspired a little bit to look into how you can be more sustainable as well.
I wanted to just say that just about the last question was remember the most eco-friendly thing you can get is something that you never have to buy. So always remember that, there are other ways to acquire what you need, ask around, borrow. But just the other really important thing is that sometimes more important than recycling a can or taking a shorter shower is joining this climate justice movement. It's really important now that we fight for our home.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, with that said, I'm going to sign off. So thank you all. It was great talking to you, and we will see you all next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, Greg.